that morning, I stepped out of our old house with my usual quiet breath, carrying the weight of another poor day on my shoulders. And before I share it with you, let me gently say, I'm glad you're here with me. If you feel connected to these moments, you may tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of my journey. But only if your heart feels right about it. Now, the day began the same way most of mine did back then, with cold air slipping through my thin jacket and the dirt road stretching in front of me like it always did, showing every crack of our broken neighborhood. Mama stood behind the doorway, watching me leave, worry living in her eyes, the way hunger lived in our kitchen. And Daddy had already gone to the factory before sunrise, because poor folks don't get slow mornings. I walked toward the market where I cleaned stalls for a few coins, keeping my mask tightly in place. The calm, quiet version of myself that kept me out of trouble. And I wasn't expecting anything more than another long, tiring day. But halfway down the road, when the sky was still a pale gray, I heard the soft hum of a car engine behind me, too smooth, too clean for this street. And something about that sound made my steps slow without meaning to. Rich people never stopped here. They only passed through on their way to better places. So when the car actually pulled over near the corner shop, a small shiver moved through me. The shiny black door opened, and a young man stepped out, dressed in clothes that looked untouched by the world I lived in. His face calm, his posture unsure, like he had accidentally stepped into a life he had never seen before. I lowered my eyes the moment he glanced my way, because poor girls don't stare at rich boys. It only leads to trouble or humiliation. But even as I looked away, I felt the strange pull of the moment, the kind that slips into your memory before you understand why. In that second, without knowing it, the title of today's story began to make sense, because I truly was just a poor girl until his car stopped near me. And that simple pause on a dusty road marked the quiet start of something neither of us could have predicted. I tried to keep walking, to pretend the moment didn't shake me. But before I could take 3 more steps, something unexpected happened behind me, something that forced him to speak to me for the very first time. I didn't plan to turn around, but what he said made me freeze in my tracks. I stopped mid-step when I heard his voice behind me, soft but clear, asking, "Excuse me, can you help me for a moment?" And even though my instinct told me to keep walking, something in the way he said it made my feet refuse to move. I turned slowly, keeping my mask on tight, the calm and quiet version of myself that protected me from the judgment of people who came from a better world. And when our eyes met again, I saw a confusion on his face that wasn't cruel or proud. It was real, almost nervous, like he truly didn't know how to stand in a poor neighborhood without feeling out of place. He held a small paper map in his hand, the kind rich folks used before phones did everything. And he pointed at the road with a helpless look, asking if this was the right direction to a village outside town. I could have answered in 2 words, but for a moment, I just studied him, wondering why a man dressed in clean clothes and polished shoes would stop his expensive car on a road full of dust and broken stones. I finally told him he had taken the wrong turn, and he let out a soft breath running his hand through his hair like he had been lost for a while. He stepped a little closer, but not too close, and thanked me with a kind tone that didn't match the usual sharp voices rich boys used when talking to people like me. I nodded and tried to walk away, wanting to escape before someone saw me standing beside a shiny car like I belonged there. But as I turned, he called out again, asking if I could guide him to the main road because the map wasn't helping. I hesitated, not because I didn't know the way, but because walking beside someone like him felt dangerous. People talk, people judge, and being a poor girl means even innocent moments get twisted into shame. But Mama had raised me to never refuse help when someone was lost, so I agreed quietly, keeping a small distance between us as we walked. He introduced himself with a simple smile, but I didn't share my name, not yet, because names carry stories, and I wasn't ready for him to hear mine. Still, every few seconds, he tried to make small conversation, asking things like how long I had lived here, and whether the mornings were always this cold. And even though I answered with short, polite phrases, a small part of me noticed something different about him, something gentle, something patient, like he wasn't trying to stand above me. As we reached the wider road where his car could continue smoothly, he stopped walking and thanked me again, this time with a sincerity that made me look up for just a moment. And when our eyes met, there was a warmth I didn't expect to feel from someone who came from wealth. Before he opened his car door, he turned to me and said words that stayed in my mind far longer than they should have. I'm glad you were the one who helped me today. You made this morning easier than you know. And even though I kept my expression steady, something in my chest shifted quietly, as if the path of the day had changed without asking my permission. And I didn't yet know that this small moment would return to me again before sunset. As his car rolled slowly back onto the main road, I started heading toward the market again, trying to shake off the strange feeling his words left behind, because poor girls like me weren't supposed to hold on to moments like that. They weren't meant for us. And yet, something about the softness in his voice lingered in my mind longer than it should have. The morning crowd was gathering by the time I reached the market. Vendors unlocking their metal shutters, wooden crates being dragged across the ground, and the familiar mix of dust and fruit smell filling the air, pulling me back into the reality I knew too well. I slipped into the back area to start cleaning the stalls, scrubbing the counters, and sweeping the floor just like every other day. But my thoughts kept drifting to the way he looked when he realized he was lost, how he seemed more human than wealthy, how his smile wasn't heavy with pride like the others from his world. And I hated that I was thinking about it, because feelings never treated poor girls kindly. They only reminded us of the distance between who we were and who the world allowed us to be. Still, as I washed the buckets and arranged the cloths, I kept replaying his voice, saying he was glad I helped him. A kindness so simple yet rare in a life where most people talked down to me without knowing my name. Mama always said life gives small signs before a big change. But I never believed her, because nothing in our world ever shifted unless we pushed it with our own tired hands. feeling inside me that morning made me wonder if she had been right all along. While I was lost in thought, Mr. Collins, the stall owner, called my name with a hint of impatience, asking why I was slower than usual, and I quickly apologized, hiding the truth behind the same mask I had worn for years, the calm and quiet one that kept my real emotions tucked away from judgment. I went back to work, trying to stay focused. But the minute the sound of a familiar engine reached my ears from the other side of the market, my heart stilled for a brief second, because I recognized it, not from sight, but from the smooth, steady hum that had stopped near me earlier. I looked up without meaning to, and there he was again, stepping out of the same black car, scanning the market as if he were searching for someone. And when his eyes finally landed on me, his expression lifted in a way that made my breath pause, as if he was relieved he had found me, though I had no idea why he needed me a second time in the same morning. When I saw him walking toward me through the thin morning crowd, my hands froze around the cloth I was using to wipe the counter, because no rich man had ever returned to a place like this twice in one morning, and certainly not looking the way he did, focused, almost relieved, like finding me had been important for some reason I couldn't understand. Mr. Collins glanced at him too, raising his brow in suspicion, because rich folks only came here to complain, never to ask for anything gentle. So I stepped slightly aside, trying not to draw attention, but the young man stopped right in front of the stall and met my eyes again with a small, breathless smile, saying, "Sorry to bother you, but I forgot to ask your name earlier." And for a moment, my heart stumbled against my ribs, because names were personal. Names held history, and poor girls didn't hand their names to strangers who came from polished worlds. I lowered my gaze and told him quietly that it wasn't necessary, that I was just glad he found his way. But he shook his head with a sincerity that made me uncomfortable in a way I didn't dislike, saying he wanted to thank me properly, because not everyone would have helped a stranger so early in the morning. Before I could argue again, Mr. Collins stepped closer, clearing his throat like he was guarding his territory, asking sharply if there was a problem. And I felt the heat of embarrassment rise in my chest, because poor folks like us always feared judgment. One misunderstood moment and rumors spread like wildfire. The young man quickly shook his head, explaining politely that he just wanted to offer gratitude to the girl who helped him earlier. And the way he said "the girl" made Mr. Collins glance toward me as if he had missed something important. Sensing the tension, I whispered my name, just Janet, nothing more, and the man repeated it softly like he was memorizing it, a single word that suddenly felt heavier in the air than it should have. He then reached into his jacket, pulling out a small card, offering it to me carefully without forcing it, saying if I ever needed anything, or if I ever came near the city he lived in, I could contact him, though I had no idea what purpose that would ever serve for someone like me. I didn't take the card at first, because accepting anything from a wealthy person in front of others could spark the wrong stories. But he didn't push, just held it patiently with an expression that felt almost grateful. Before I could decide, Mr. Collins told me to get back to work, his tone sharp and irritated, and the young man nodded respectfully, placing the card gently on the counter instead, saying he hoped I'd keep it, even if I never used it. He stepped back, gave me one last look, warm, unhurried, almost curious, and then walked away toward his car, as if something unfinished hung between us, something neither of us understood yet. I tried to ignore the small card lying under my fingertips, but the soft feeling in my chest wouldn't disappear. And even as the market noise rose around me, I knew the day wasn't done with surprises. I didn't touch the card for a long time, not because I didn't want to, but because it felt like a key to a world I wasn't allowed to enter. And poor girls like me learned early that curiosity can be dangerous when it comes wrapped in polished clothes and polite smiles. The morning work blurred as I went from stall to stall, wiping counters, arranging baskets of vegetables, and listening to the low hum of voices from vendors already used to the rhythm of their daily lives. But my mind kept slipping back to the way he had said my name, the gentleness in his eyes, and the patience he had shown when my mask wouldn't let me answer too much. Mama's warnings echoed softly in my thoughts. Never trust those who have never struggled, she'd say. And I felt both the truth of her words and the strange pull that ignored them. The kind of pull that made your chest ache, even if your head told you to walk away. During the busiest hour, I watched people pass by the market, some throwing quick glances at the neat young man who had stopped by. Their curiosity mingled with judgment, and I felt again the old shame of poverty pressing against my ribs, reminding me that my shoes were patched, my clothes worn, and my hands calloused from endless work, while he moved in a world I could only imagine. Yet in small stolen moments, my mind wandered to him, not in a way that made me forget myself, but in a way that made me feel alive, as if something beyond survival could exist for me too. Though I didn't dare voice it, the card sat on the edge of the counter, half hidden under a pile of fruit, and every time I glanced at it, a tiny warmth rose in my chest, though I kept my expression calm, hiding what I felt as carefully as I hid my hunger or my fears. By the time the morning began to fold into early afternoon, the market was full of bargaining voices and clanging coins. Yet I found myself staring out the entrance, wondering if the car would return, if he would come back to speak again, if this brief morning encounter meant anything beyond the ordinary moments of a poor girl's life. I knew even then that something had changed, subtle but undeniable, the way a shadow shifts when the sun tilts. And I also knew that the rest of my day would be shaped quietly by this stranger who had stepped into my world, uninvited but not unwelcome, and by the card lying in front of me, waiting for the choice I wasn't sure I was ready to make. By mid-afternoon, the market had settled into its slower rhythm, vendors counting coins and calling out final deals, and I found myself taking small breaks between sweeping and stacking, my hands sticky from fruit juice and dust, but my mind far away, circling the morning encounter over and over, wondering why a man like him would remember me at all, much less care enough to leave that card. I tucked the card into the pocket of my worn jacket, careful not to let anyone see it, because appearances mattered here more than words ever could. And poor girls learned that keeping the small things hidden sometimes kept you safe from gossip and judgment. Still, every few minutes my eyes drifted toward the street, imagining him returning, imagining a reason he might actually want to talk again. Though my mind told me stories I would never voice, that rich people don't linger in places like this unless they have a purpose. And purpose from someone like him rarely had anything to do with me. A simple girl born into struggle, yet the way he had spoken, the softness in his voice, and the patience in his eyes lingered stubbornly in my chest, refusing to leave me entirely, as if the morning had planted a seed I didn't yet understand. Mama's words and warnings replayed like a loop I couldn't escape. People like him, Janet, they don't belong here. But beneath that caution, a part of me whispered curiosity. And even though I shook my head to scold myself, I couldn't stop thinking about what it would mean if he returned, or if this small piece of his world had actually noticed me. The market was quieter now, with only a few late customers bargaining for fruits and vegetables, and I leaned against a wooden crate for a moment, letting the sun warm my tired back, imagining what it would be like to walk alongside someone who moved in a world I had only glimpsed from afar, and feeling a strange mixture of fear, hope, and longing that I had never allowed myself to feel in public. I checked the card again, the edges frayed slightly from my fingers, and I realized that this simple rectangle of paper was heavier than any coin or note I had ever held, because it carried a choice, a possibility. And even though I had no right to dream, no right to step outside my invisible boundaries, my chest tightened with the knowledge that the day had quietly shifted, that my ordinary life had been brushed by something extraordinary, and that I would never see a morning the same way again. By the time the sun tilted toward late afternoon, the market was slowly emptying, vendors packing up their remaining goods, and the familiar rhythm of life around me felt both comforting and strange, because the morning had introduced a quiet tension I couldn't shake. I kept my hands busy folding cloths and stacking baskets, but every so often my eyes flicked toward the street, half expecting the black car to glide back into view, half fearing the impossible thought that I wanted it to. Mama came around the corner, carrying a basket of bread she had bought for supper, and her eyes caught mine briefly, sharp and knowing, as if she could read the restless thoughts behind my calm mask, the mask I had perfected to hide everything I truly felt. And I gave her a small nod, smiling just enough to reassure her, without revealing how a simple stranger had stirred something I didn't even have words for. Daddy's factory whistle echoed faintly in the distance, reminding me of the endless grind of life we lived, the toil that never stopped, and the invisible line between people like us and people like him, a line that seemed thinner this afternoon, though I dared not step too close to it. The card, tucked safely into the pocket of my jacket, was a small weight against my side, a symbol of the curiosity and unease churning inside me. And I caught myself imagining what it would be like if I dared to use it, if I dared to step outside my known world for even a single encounter. And even the thought made my heart race with fear and excitement I had long buried under years of survival. A few customers lingered by the stalls, picking through produce, chatting quietly, completely unaware that their presence made my thoughts race, that their normalcy contrasted with the extraordinary event that had brushed past me earlier, leaving a ripple I couldn't explain. I washed my hands in the small basin at the back, letting the cold water shock me into the present. But my mind kept circling him, his gentle smile, the way he had looked at me as though I were more than the dusty road and patched clothes I carried. And I realized I was replaying every moment, every word, every glance, as though trying to memorize it before the day swallowed it up as shadows stretched across the market, signaling the close of another ordinary day. I packed the last of the empty baskets, glancing once more toward the street, feeling a mix of fear, longing, and cautious hope because I had no idea what tomorrow would bring. But I knew that morning had changed something inside me forever, something quiet and invisible, yet impossible to ignore, the first whisper of a life that might one day be far different than the one I had always known, even after the market quieted down and the last few customers trickled away. My thoughts refused to settle, dragging me back to the morning and that single moment when he had looked at me with a softness I had never seen before. And as I carried the empty crates toward the back alley, my hands ached from work, but my chest ached more, tight with the strange awareness that something had shifted in my life. Without warning, Mama had begun sweeping near the doorway, humming low to herself, but I could barely hear her tune over the constant echo of his voice in my memory, polite and patient, completely unlike the voices of those who had ever looked down on me for being poor. And for a fleeting second, I wondered what kind of world he had come from. A world so different, yet somehow drawn to mine, and I felt the weight of both curiosity and fear pressing down. The kind only a poor girl learns to carry quietly. I reached into my pocket to touch the card, feeling its edges, smooth yet firm, as if it held a secret meant only for me. And I thought about the courage it would take to ever use it, to step into his world where money, manners, and expectations towered over everything I had ever known. And yet, the small smile in his eyes kept tugging at a part of me I had long ignored, whispering that life could be bigger than dusty roads and constant struggle. Daddy's whistle sounded faint in the distance, reminding me that the world outside my thoughts didn't stop for anyone. And I swallowed hard, realizing that life demanded I keep moving, keep surviving. Yet part of me ached to linger, to imagine even a tiny thread connecting me to the warmth and gentleness he had offered that morning. As I stacked the last crate and turned toward home, the evening shadows stretching long across the uneven ground, I couldn't stop thinking that nothing about that encounter was ordinary, that the quiet kindness he had shown was a stark contrast to the judgment and distance that always defined interactions between people like us and people like him. And I felt the strange mix of hope, fear, and unspoken longing twist inside me like a small storm. By the time I reached the dirt path leading back to our house, I realized the day had left an invisible mark, a whisper of a life that might someday be different. And though I kept my expression calm and my mask firmly in place, inside I was no longer entirely the same girl who had stepped out that morning walking back home along the familiar dirt path. I felt the weight of the day pressing on me in a way that work and chores never had. Every step seemed heavier because my mind kept returning to him, the stranger with gentle eyes, the one who had stopped his polished black car near me that morning, the one who had taken the time to speak and remember my name. As if I mattered in a world where people like me were usually invisible, Mama called out from the doorway, her voice carrying the same warmth and caution it always had, reminding me to be careful and not linger on idle thoughts. But I barely heard her, my hands gripping the worn straps of my bag as I walked, my heart still racing from moments that should have been ordinary but weren't, moments that had a quiet weight I couldn't explain. I thought about the card in my pocket, the small rectangle of paper that seemed to carry a promise or a question I wasn't ready to answer. And I wondered what it meant that he had returned to that street, had looked for me among the vendors, had treated me like a person instead of a shadow, the way the world usually treated girls like me. Daddy's figure appeared faint at the end of the path, coming home from the factory, his shoulders hunched with exhaustion, reminding me that life didn't pause for thoughts or feelings, that the grind of survival continued regardless of who crossed our path or who left a mark on our hearts. And yet, the memory of his voice, soft and patient, lingered stubbornly in mine, making the chores of life seem both heavier and lighter at the same time. As I stepped into the small yard, the familiar smell of cooking filled the air, Mama busy with supper, and I felt the contrast sharply, the small, ordinary comfort of home against the extraordinary weight of the morning's encounter. And I realized that this quiet, unremarkable day had already begun to change me, had already carved a small space in my heart for someone I barely knew, someone whose world was so far from mine, yet had somehow touched it gently. I placed the card on the edge of the table, not daring to look at it too long, yet unable to ignore it. And as the evening sun cast long shadows over our humble home, I understood that life had started whispering about possibilities I had never allowed myself to imagine. And though I kept my mask firmly in place, calm and collected, a small, undeniable part of me trembled with the awareness that this day, simple, quiet, ordinary, had become the first of many that would quietly lead me toward a future I didn't yet understand. That night, after supper, I sat quietly on the small wooden step outside our house, the card resting on my lap, its edges soft from being touched repeatedly. And I felt the strange weight of the day settle over me, heavier than the chores, heavier than the dust on my shoes, heavier than the constant worry of keeping my family fed. Mama moved about inside, humming low and calling occasionally for me to help with dishes. But I stayed where I was, staring at the fading light on the horizon, letting my mind drift back to him, the stranger with patient eyes, the one who had stepped into my poor, ordinary morning, and somehow left a quiet trace on my heart. I thought about the way he had returned to look for me, how he had remembered my name, how he had treated me like a human being rather than a shadow of the world around him. And I wondered why the smallest kindness from someone with so much made my chest tighten, with emotion I had never allowed myself to feel openly. My fingers traced the card over and over, imagining a life that seemed impossible, imagining what it would mean to step into a world where people didn't judge by the worn shoes or patched clothes, but by the person inside. And yet the reality of our neighborhood, the weight of poverty and survival, pressed down on me, reminding me that moments like this were rare and delicate, meant to be held quietly within, not acted upon recklessly. I thought of Daddy returning from the factory, his worn hands and tired eyes a constant reminder that life demanded endurance, that dreams didn't feed the stomach or patch the roof. And yet, the gentleness in his voice lingered in my memory, persistent like a small fire that refused to go out, showing me that not everything extraordinary is loud or obvious, that sometimes the world whispers possibilities you cannot yet grasp, but will remember for a lifetime. As the sky darkened and stars began to peek through, I tucked the card carefully into my pocket, feeling its weight like a secret I could carry alone. And I realized that something inside me had quietly shifted, that the day, ordinary in so many ways, had changed my heart, made me aware that kindness and patience could come from the most unexpected places. And even though I kept my calm mask firmly in place, a part of me already longed to see him again, to understand why this one morning had mattered more than any other day I had lived. I finally stood and went inside, careful to keep the card hidden from Mama, careful to keep the warmth of hope tucked quietly behind my chest, knowing that tomorrow, like every day after, I would carry the memory of this simple, powerful encounter with me, shaping the smallest choices, the quietest thoughts, and the tenderest part of my heart that dared to imagine a life slightly bigger than the one I had always known. The next morning arrived with the same dull gray light filtering through the cracks of our wooden house. But I felt different, as though the small events of the day before had quietly shifted something inside me, making even the familiar chill of dawn feel unusual. I rose before Mama, careful not to disturb her rest, and dressed quickly in my worn clothes, slipping the card into my pocket once more, its weight reassuring and terrifying all at once, because it reminded me that a world far beyond my own had touched mine, a world I could not yet enter, but already felt connected to in ways I could not explain. I stepped outside, the air cold against my cheeks, and the street looked the same, dusty, uneven, alive, with the quiet sounds of neighbors beginning their day. But my eyes searched for that black car instinctively, though I told myself firmly that he probably wouldn't come again so soon, that he had his life and I had mine, a life filled with chores, survival, and invisible boundaries that separated people like us from people like him. Still, the memory of his patient eyes, the careful way he had spoken, the quiet respect he had shown in a world that rarely offered it to girls like me, lingered stubbornly, twisting into a strange ache that made me walk slower, breathe deeper, and notice everything around me more sharply, as if the ordinary world had been newly revealed through his presence. I passed the small market on the corner, watching the vendors prepare for another day, listening to their calls and the clatter of crates. and I imagined what it would be like if he had walked among them, not as a stranger from a polished car, but as someone willing to step into my world, to notice it fully. And I realized that part of me was longing for a connection I had never allowed myself to hope for, a bridge between the ordinary and the extraordinary. The card pressed against my hip, and I kept fingering it in my pocket, imagining the possibilities it represented, while knowing full well that poverty had taught me to be cautious, to never trust appearances, to hide feelings, to keep my chest calm and my mask firmly in place. Even when my heart whispered that life could offer more, by the time the first vendors began calling out greetings, I had arrived at my usual spot to clean. And though my hands moved automatically over counters and baskets, my mind wandered repeatedly to that single morning encounter, wondering if it was an accident or if fate had a quiet way of weaving our paths together. And I realized, with a mix of fear and anticipation, that the memory of him had already begun to shape the way I saw the world, the way I imagined possibilities, and the way I understood that even a brief act of kindness could change the course of a poor girl's ordinary life in ways she never expected. The morning passed in the usual rhythm of cleaning, arranging, and sweeping, but my mind refused to follow the ordinary rhythm of labor, circling instead around him, the stranger whose quiet kindness had unsettled the careful balance of my world. Each sound, the clatter of a crate, the hum of distant engines, the murmur of voices, pulled me back to the memory of his patient eyes and the soft words he had spoken, reminding me that some people could move through the world without the sharp judgment that came so easily to those who had grown up above us. I caught myself imagining him waiting somewhere beyond the edge of my vision, imagining a polite smile or a gentle request that would allow him to step further into the ordinary life of a poor girl. And I felt a strange mixture of longing and fear, because curiosity was dangerous in my world, and hope was a fragile thing, not meant for girls like me who had been taught to endure, not to imagine. I kept glancing at the card in my pocket, running my fingers over its edges, and the weight of it pressed against my hip like a secret only I could carry, reminding me that the ordinary rules of our neighborhood didn't apply to the world he came from. And yet, somehow, the boundaries between our lives had begun to blur in ways I didn't fully understand. Mama called from inside, asking if I needed help with anything, and I nodded without looking, hiding the storm of thoughts and feelings behind my calm mask, the mask that had protected me from judgment and pity for years. Even though my chest tightened with an ache, I couldn't speak aloud. Every small task, the sweeping, the stacking of baskets, the wiping of counters, felt heavier, yet strangely lighter, weighed down by my awareness of him and lifted by the quiet warmth of his attention. And I realized that a single moment, a single exchange of words and glances, could disrupt the rhythm of an entire life and leave traces that were impossible to ignore. By the time the late morning sun filtered through the thin gaps in the market's roof, I had begun to understand that I would never look at another ordinary day the same way, that the memory of his presence, his gentleness, and the simple card in my pocket had planted a quiet seed of possibility in my heart, one that neither poverty nor caution could fully extinguish. And though I continued to move through the motions of work with my mask firmly in place, inside I felt a trembling anticipation, a hope wrapped in fear that whispered quietly of a life and a connection I had never dared to imagine, and yet now could no longer ignore. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the market buzzed with activity, vendors calling out prices and customers haggling. But I moved through it all like a shadow, my hands busy, yet my mind caught entirely in the morning, tracing over the image of him, the young man who had stopped his sleek black car to speak to me, the one whose kindness had unsettled me in ways I didn't fully understand every time I lifted a crate or swept the counters. I felt the weight of the card in my pocket pressing gently against my hip, a reminder that the world beyond my own could be unexpectedly gentle, and that even someone so far from my life could notice me, see me, and treat me as a person rather than a girl defined by poverty and circumstance. I thought about how carefully he had spoken, how he had remembered my name, and how he had waited without judgment. And I realized that I had never been seen like that before, not by strangers, not by rich or poor alike. And the thought made my chest ache with longing, fear, and a strange hope I wasn't supposed to feel. Mama glanced at me from across the market as she sold bread, her expression sharp but concerned, as if she could sense that my mind had drifted far from the chores. And I gave her a small nod, pretending calm while inside my heart pounded with the memory of his gentle smile and quiet patience, the way he had made the impossible seem ordinary for a moment, a fleeting gift in a world that usually offered nothing but work and endurance. I imagined him walking through the crowded street again, asking for my help or simply smiling, and felt a small shiver at the thought of our worlds colliding once more. Worlds so different, yet inexplicably connected in the brief encounter that had already begun to shape my perception of life, kindness, and possibility. As the day wore on, the shadows lengthened and the air grew warm with late afternoon heat, and I realized that I carried more than dust and fruit scents from the market. I carried the memory of him, the card, and the quiet stirrings of a heart daring to imagine a life slightly bigger than the one I had always known. And I understood that this invisible change inside me was something I would carry silently and carefully until the moment our paths crossed again. By late afternoon, the market had emptied, leaving only the faint echo of voices and the occasional scrape of a crate being pushed, and I leaned against the edge of a stall, feeling the familiar ache of tired muscles, while my mind raced endlessly around him, the stranger whose gentle attention had made my chest tighten in ways I could neither name nor control. The card in my pocket had become heavier with each passing hour, a small, tangible reminder that someone from a world I could barely imagine had noticed me, that someone had paused, observed, and offered kindness without judgment. And the thought both thrilled and frightened me, because poor girls like me were trained to expect indifference or scorn, not quiet care from someone so far removed from our lives. Mama called me from inside the shop, asking if I needed water, and I shook my head, not wanting to speak aloud the tumult of feelings churning within me, keeping my calm mask firmly in place, while every fiber of my being whispered that the day had shifted, that ordinary routines could no longer contain the stirring curiosity and longing he had awakened in me. As I stacked the last empty crates, I imagined the moment he had driven away, the soft hum of the car fading into the distance, leaving me alone with the memory of his patient eyes and the careful words he had spoken. And I realized that something inside me had quietly begun to hope, to wonder, to imagine a life where the harsh lines of poverty and the polished surface of wealth might somehow meet without fear or shame. The sun dipped lower, casting long, warm shadows across the dusty path leading home, and each step I took felt heavier and lighter at the same time. Heavier with the knowledge that my ordinary life had been touched by something extraordinary. Lighter because a new possibility had quietly appeared, delicate and fragile, but impossible to ignore. I thought of tomorrow, of the streets, of the market, and of the chance that he might appear again. And the simple act of imagining it made my heart race. A pulse I had long buried beneath years of survival and cautious living, and I understood that my quiet, disciplined existence had already begun to bend, to make room for something uncertain yet compelling, something that whispered to the deepest parts of me that life, in its most unexpected moments, could offer more than endurance, more than labor, more than the ordinary days I had always known, and that perhaps the smallest gestures, patience, kindness, recognition, could plant the seeds of a future I had not dared to hope for until now. That evening, as I walked the narrow path back home, the air thick with the scent of dust and fading sunlight, my thoughts refused to settle, circling endlessly around him, the stranger whose brief kindness had etched itself into the corners of my heart. Each step felt heavier with the weight of possibility, yet lighter with the strange warmth that his presence had left behind. A warmth so unexpected that it frightened me more than the harsh lessons poverty had taught. I kept my hands in my pockets, fingers brushing the card again and again, feeling the smooth edges press against my palm, reminding me that someone from a world so different had seen me, had treated me like I mattered. And the knowledge both thrilled and terrified me, because girls like me weren't supposed to dream beyond survival, weren't supposed to imagine someone looking at us without judgment or pity. Mama's voice floated from inside, calling me to help with supper, but I barely heard her, lost in the quiet replay of his smile, his words, the way he had waited patiently as I considered helping him, and the careful manner in which he had spoken, as if every word mattered and no assumptions were made about me, my life, or my struggles. Daddy's distant whistle reminded me of the hard reality of our lives, the factory, the long hours, the unending grind, and I felt the stark contrast between his world and his. The invisible lines society drew between rich and poor, polite and humble, known and unseen. And yet, I also realized that those lines could bend quietly in moments that mattered. Moments like this one that I could not forget. When I reached the small gate of our yard, I paused to look at the card one last time before slipping it safely into my jacket, feeling its weight like a secret I alone could hold, a seed of a story I did not yet know the ending of. And I knew, even as the evening settled and the shadows deepened across the yard, that my ordinary life had been forever touched by a single act of attention, by a man who had noticed me, and that the pull of that memory, soft and persistent, would shape every step I took, every thought I had, and every heartbeat I couldn't silence, quietly weaving the promise of change into the ordinary rhythm of my days. And the careful mask I wore to survive the next morning. Sunlight spilled weakly through the gaps in our wooden house, and I woke with the strange sense that the day would not be ordinary. Though I had no idea why, the memory of him lingered, like a quiet echo bouncing in my chest, reminding me of the kindness in his eyes, the patience in his voice, and the impossible way someone from a world so far removed could see me and treat me like I mattered. And even though I dressed in my worn clothes and tied my shoes carefully, I felt the weight of anticipation pressing gently against my ribs, the weight of a possibility I had never allowed myself to consider. Mama moved about the kitchen, humming quietly, and I nodded to her automatically, masking the turmoil inside, my mind returning again and again to the black car, to the soft smile, to the card pressed against my fingers. A fragile tether to something I could not yet name, a bridge to a world I had only glimpsed. As I stepped out onto the dusty street, the familiar sights and sounds of the market greeted me. Vendors calling out prices, crates being dragged across uneven ground, the faint scent of fruit and dust mingling in the air. And yet, everything seemed different because the morning carried the subtle tension of memory and longing, the quiet ache of a heart touched in ways I hadn't expected and couldn't yet speak aloud. Each movement of my hands, sweeping, stacking, arranging, felt heavier, yet lighter too, weighted by the knowledge that my ordinary life had been brushed by something extraordinary, a gentle interruption that stirred curiosity, hope, and a tiny fear I could not name, all woven together into a strange, delicate feeling I had never let myself feel before. I thought about the card, its smooth edges, the small promise it carried, and I realized that even though the world I lived in demanded survival, work, and caution, there were threads of possibility quietly threading themselves into my life, invisible yet undeniable. And I knew, without fully understanding how, that this day, like the morning before, would not pass without leaving its quiet mark on me, shaping my thoughts, my heart, and the careful mask I wore to keep the world from seeing the small tremors of hope stirring inside. By mid-morning, the market had settled into its usual rhythm, vendors shouting prices, baskets clattering, and the familiar scent of fruits and dust filling the air. But I moved through it all with a strange sense of detachment, my hands busy, yet my mind caught in the memory of him, the young man whose quiet attention had unsettled me, whose card rested safely in my pocket, reminding me that life could carry small surprises, even for girls like me, who had long learned to expect nothing. Every glance down the street, every flicker of movement, made my chest tighten, half hoping he might appear again, half fearing the disappointment if he didn't. And I realized that that the ordinary noise of the market could no longer drown out the extraordinary imprint he had left. A silent mark that tugged at the careful boundaries I had built around my heart for years. I tried to focus on my work, wiping counters, stacking baskets, arranging vegetables. But every small task felt both heavier and lighter, weighted by the knowledge that kindness and attention existed in the world beyond survival and poverty, and lifted by the faint thrill that someone had paused to see me as more than a shadow in the crowd. Mama's sharp eyes occasionally met mine, reading my quiet distraction, and I offered her a small nod, masking the tremor in my chest, aware that she would never understand the depth of this strange, new feeling, the way a single encounter could unsettle a life carefully structured around endurance and labor. I touched the card again, feeling the edges press into my fingers, imagining the countless possibilities it might represent, the doors it might open, and yet knowing I had to be cautious, because hope in a poor girl's life was fragile, dangerous if exposed, and often punished by reality. As the afternoon approached, the shadows lengthened across the market, stretching like reminders that the day was slipping by. And though nothing else extraordinary had happened, I could not shake the sense that my life had quietly shifted, that the memory of him, the gentle patience in his voice, and the small card in my pocket had planted a seed of possibility in a heart long trained to expect little. A seed that would grow quietly, invisibly, until the next moment when our paths might cross again. And I realized, with a mix of fear and longing, that ordinary days could no longer contain me, could no longer contain the stirring hope and cautious excitement he had awakened in a life built on survival alone. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the market in warm, fading light, I felt the weight of the day settle over me, both familiar and strange, because although my hands had moved through the usual motions of sweeping, stacking, and arranging, my mind had wandered endlessly to him, the young man whose quiet attention had unsettled the careful rhythm of my life, whose patient smile and thoughtful words replayed in my memory like a gentle echo I could neither ignore nor fully understand. The card in my pocket felt heavier with each passing hour, pressing against my hip as a reminder that someone from a world far removed had stepped into mine, had acknowledged me in a way no one else ever had. And the thought made my chest ache with a mixture of fear, longing, and curiosity I had long buried beneath years of survival and caution. I glanced up at the empty street, half expecting, half wishing to see his car appear, to hear the soft hum of it stopping near me, to see him leaning slightly toward me with the same gentle patience. And yet, the reality of our neighborhood pressed against me: dusty roads, worn shoes, patched clothes, and reminded me that bridges between our worlds were fragile and uncertain, not to be crossed recklessly. Mama called me softly from inside, asking if I had remembered to help with supper, and I nodded, hiding the tumult of thoughts within my calm mask, my chest tightening as I imagined him watching me silently, noticing my small movements, my careful mask, and recognizing the girl behind it without judgment. A notion so foreign yet comforting that it made my heart beat uneven. The The distant whistle of Daddy returning from the factory reminded me that life demanded endurance, that ordinary days continued regardless of extraordinary encounters. And yet, the quiet fire he had lit in my heart refused to go out. Whispering possibilities I had never allowed myself to imagine, hinting at a connection that could exist quietly, invisibly, beyond the boundaries drawn by poverty and circumstance. As I gathered the last baskets to carry home, the shadows lengthened across the path, stretching long and thin, and I realized with a mixture of fear, hope, and longing that the ordinary world of chores, market noise, and survival had shifted imperceptibly, but permanently, that the memory of his presence, his card, and the small gestures of patience and recognition would follow me into every corner of my life, quietly shaping my thoughts, my heart, and the careful mask I wore, while planting the first fragile seeds of a possibility I had never dared to hope for until now. That evening, as I walked slowly back to our small house, the sky painted in shades of deep orange and soft purple, I felt the quiet tension of the day still resting in my chest, a mixture of exhaustion from the market and the persistent ache left by thoughts of him, the young man whose unexpected kindness had unsettled every carefully built rule I had followed for survival. The card in my pocket seemed almost alive, pressing gently against my fingers, reminding me that a life beyond dusty streets and worn shoes existed. A life I could not yet touch, but could already feel. A life in which someone had paused to see me fully, without judgment, without assumptions. And it both thrilled and terrified me, because poor girls like me were taught to hide, to endure, and to keep hope contained, never letting it stretch beyond the boundaries our circumstances dictated. Mama's voice drifted from inside, calling me to help with supper, but I barely heard her, caught instead in a spiral of memory. The soft hum of his car engine, the careful way he had spoken my name, the patience in his smile, and the impossible warmth that had settled in my chest, whispering that ordinary days could carry extraordinary moments if one was lucky, if one dared to notice them. Daddy's distant whistle reminded me of the unrelenting rhythm of our lives, the grind of survival, the constant work that left no space for daydreams or fragile hopes. Yet inside me, the memory of him refused to fade, pressing quietly, insistently, as if life had shifted imperceptibly, leaving a small crack in the walls I had built to protect myself from disappointment and longing. I touched the card again, feeling its smooth edges, imagining the possibility that it represented, a bridge to a world I had only glimpsed, a world of patience, attention, and care that seemed impossible, but had been offered to me anyway. And I realized that even if he never appeared again, even if life returned to its ordinary grind, this day, this moment, had changed me, leaving me aware of possibilities I had never allowed myself to consider, teaching me that the smallest gestures could carry the weight of hope, that kindness could alter the course of a girl's ordinary life, and that sometimes the most profound shifts happen quietly, leaving you trembling in your chest with the first fragile awareness that life could hold more than survival, more than endurance, more than the mask you wear to keep the world at bay. By the time night settled over our small neighborhood, the sky dark and dotted with faint stars, I finally sat down on the worn wooden step outside our house. The day's exhaustion in my muscles, but the memory of him, the young man who had stopped, smiled, and treated me like I mattered, still vivid in my chest. A gentle ache I could not shake. The card in my pocket felt heavier than ever, as if carrying not just words, but a tiny promise of something I didn't yet understand. A whisper of a life beyond dusty streets and worn shoes, a world that seemed impossible yet had touched me so quietly that I could not deny its presence. And I traced its edges again and again, knowing that it had changed me in ways no one else could see, in ways I could never fully explain. Mama called softly from inside, reminding me to wash up before bed, and I obeyed, hiding the storm of thoughts behind the calm mask I wore for survival. But inside, my heart fluttered with anticipation, curiosity, and longing, realizing that this one encounter had quietly planted a seed of hope, one that might grow slowly, invisibly, until it reached a place I could scarcely imagine. I thought of the contrast between our lives, Daddy's long hours at the factory, the struggle of survival, the invisible lines drawn between rich and poor, and the gentle patience he had shown me, how easily he had bridged a world I had always believed was out of reach. And I felt a mix of awe, fear, and cautious excitement, knowing that the ordinary rules of my life were subtly bending, making room for a connection that might one day bring something extraordinary into the quiet rhythm of our days. As the night deepened, I tucked the card safely under my pillow, feeling its weight like a secret treasure, a reminder that life could offer moments of unexpected kindness, and even a poor girl like me could be seen, remembered, and treated with respect. And for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future where boundaries might not be permanent, where hearts could quietly connect across worlds, and where the smallest gestures could alter the course of a life forever. With that thought resting softly in my chest, I whispered a quiet hope into the night, leaned back against the wooden step, and felt, for the first time in a long time, that my ordinary life had been touched by something extraordinary, and that tomorrow might hold more than survival. It might hold the gentle promise of beginnings.